Before we begin Saladin's story, it is important to understand the world into which he was born, a world already shaped by decades of war, religious conflict, and political division. In 1099, the First Crusade ended with the capture of Jerusalem by armies from Western Europe. After a long and brutal campaign, Crusader forces established Christian rule over the city and created a series of states across the Holy Land, including the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, and the County of Tripoli. For many Christians in Europe, these victories were celebrated as a triumph of faith. For the Muslim world, however, they represented a profound political and military failure. The Middle East of the 12th century was deeply fragmented. Powerful Muslim rulers governed different regions, but unity was rare. Rival dynasties competed for influence, local governors pursued their own ambitions, and alliances shifted constantly. While the Crusader states strengthened their position along the eastern Mediterranean coast, many Muslim leaders remained focused on conflicts with one another. The region possessed great wealth, great cities, and great armies, but little cohesion. It was into this divided world that Saladin was born. Around 1137 or 1138, Salah-ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known to history as Saladin, was born in the city of Tikrit in present-day Iraq. He came from a Kurdish family whose fortunes were tied to military and administrative service. His father, Ayub, and his uncle, Shirkuh, served regional rulers and would later become important figures in the political struggles of Syria and Egypt. Nothing in Saladin's early years suggested that he would one day become one of the most famous rulers in history. Unlike many legendary conquerors, he was not known as a child warrior or military prodigy. Contemporary accounts describe him as intelligent, disciplined, and deeply interested in religion and scholarship. His education focused on Islamic law, theology, literature, and administration. He spent far more time studying than commanding soldiers. Those who knew him during his youth saw a thoughtful and capable young man, but not necessarily a future empire builder. In fact, the figures who attracted attention were often the experienced commanders around him, particularly his uncle Shirkuh. Saladin lived largely in their shadow. Few observers would have predicted that this quiet Kurdish noble would eventually unite much of the Muslim world and challenge the Crusader kingdoms more successfully than any leader before him. But history often hides its most important figures in plain sight. Before he became a conqueror, a statesman, or a symbol of resistance, Saladin was simply a young man growing up in a fractured world, one that desperately needed a leader, though few yet knew it. History's greatest figures often begin as ordinary people. By the middle of the 12th century, the Muslim world was still divided, but powerful leaders had begun working toward greater unity. Among them was Nur ad-Din, one of the most respected rulers of his age. Determined to strengthen Muslim resistance against the Crusader states, Nur ad-Din sought to expand his influence beyond Syria and into Egypt, a wealthy and strategically vital region whose political future had become increasingly uncertain. It was during these struggles that Saladin first emerged onto the larger stage of history. As a young man, Saladin entered the service of Nur ad-Din and accompanied his uncle, Shirkuh, on military expeditions to Egypt. At the time, Egypt was ruled by the weakening Fatimid Caliphate, whose internal conflicts had created opportunities for outside intervention. Various factions competed for power, while both Crusader and Syrian forces sought influence over the region. The political situation was extraordinarily complex. Alliances shifted rapidly. Former enemies became temporary partners, only to become rivals again months later. Military campaigns were often accompanied by negotiations, betrayals, and struggles for influence behind palace walls. In this environment, survival required not only military skill but also political intelligence. Saladin was not the obvious candidate for greatness. He was neither the most famous commander nor the most powerful noble in Nur ad-Din's service. Much of the attention focused on Shirkuh, whose military reputation far exceeded that of his nephew. Yet as events unfolded, circumstances began to favor Saladin in unexpected ways. In 1169, Shirkuh succeeded in securing control over Egypt, but died only months later. His death created a sudden power vacuum. Several figures appeared better positioned to assume leadership, yet Saladin emerged as the compromise candidate. To many observers, he seemed young, relatively inexperienced, and unlikely to challenge the interests of competing factions. They underestimated him. After becoming vizier of Egypt, Saladin steadily consolidated his authority. Through careful administration, political skill, and the cultivation of loyal supporters, he strengthened his position while navigating the dangerous rivalries that surrounded him. Over time, he moved beyond the role of a temporary official and became the dominant power in Egypt. The rise was remarkable not because Saladin seized power through dramatic conquest, but because he achieved it when few expected him to do so. The quiet Kurdish noble who had once lived in the shadow of stronger personalities now ruled one of the wealthiest regions in the Islamic world. It was the beginning of a transformation that would reshape the Middle East. For Saladin, the path to power had not been planned from childhood. He had not appeared destined for a throne. Yet history had placed opportunity before him, and he had proven capable of seizing it. When Saladin rose to power in Egypt, the greatest threat facing the Muslim world was not the Crusader states alone. The deeper problem was division. Nearly 70 years had passed since the First Crusade, yet Muslim rulers remained politically fragmented. Powerful dynasties governed different regions, local emirs pursued their own ambitions, and rival factions often viewed one another with as much suspicion as they viewed the Crusaders. While Christian kingdoms maintained their foothold in the Holy Land, the Muslim world lacked the unity needed to mount a coordinated response. Saladin understood this reality better than most. After securing his position in Egypt, he began pursuing a goal far greater than personal advancement. Rather than focusing solely on expanding his own authority, he worked to bring together the major Muslim territories of the region. This was not a simple task. Every ruler had supporters, allies, and interests to protect. Any attempt at unification risked provoking resistance from those who feared losing power. The death of Nur ad-Din in 1174 created both an opportunity and a challenge. Without Nur ad-Din's leadership, Syria faced uncertainty. Competing factions struggled for influence, and several leaders sought to protect their own positions. Saladin moved carefully, presenting himself not as a conqueror seeking personal glory, but as a leader capable of preserving stability and continuing the broader mission of Muslim unity. His efforts met resistance. Some rulers opposed him openly. Others questioned his intentions. Military campaigns were often necessary, but diplomacy played an equally important role. Through negotiation, alliances, and strategic pressure, Saladin gradually extended his influence beyond Egypt and into Syria. City by city and province by province, he assembled a larger political structure than any Muslim ruler in the region had controlled for generations. Yet Saladin's vision extended beyond territory. He recognized that defeating the Crusader states would require more than armies. It demanded administrative stability, economic strength, and a sense of shared purpose among diverse peoples. He invested in governance, strengthened institutions, and worked to create a state capable of sustaining long-term campaigns. These foundations were just as important as military victories. By the early 1180s, Saladin had achieved something remarkable. Much of Egypt and Syria now operated under his authority or influence. The fragmented political landscape that had once weakened Muslim resistance was slowly being transformed into a more unified front. This achievement revealed one of the defining qualities of Saladin's leadership. He understood that lasting success could not be built on conquest alone. Before confronting a powerful enemy, a leader must first overcome the divisions within his own ranks. Only after uniting his people could Saladin begin preparing for the struggle that would define his legacy. The road to Jerusalem did not begin on the battlefield. It began with the difficult task of bringing a divided world together. By the late 1170s, two remarkable leaders had emerged on opposite sides of the struggle for the Holy Land. One was the rising Muslim ruler Saladin, steadily uniting Egypt and Syria under his authority. The other was an unlikely king whose determination would earn the respect of both allies and enemies, Baldwin IV of Jerusalem. Baldwin's story was extraordinary from the beginning. As a child, he was diagnosed with leprosy, a disease that would gradually rob him of his strength, mobility, and sight. In an age when physical ability was closely tied to leadership, many doubted whether he could rule at all. Yet despite his illness, Baldwin refused to withdraw from public life. He remained actively involved in government, military planning, and the defense of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. For Saladin, Baldwin represented a serious obstacle to his ambitions. While the Muslim world was becoming more united, Jerusalem still possessed capable leadership. Baldwin's determination and political skill helped keep the Crusader kingdom stable during years of growing pressure. Even as his health deteriorated, he continued leading efforts to resist Saladin's expansion. Their most famous confrontation came in 1177 at the Battle of Montgesard. Confident in his growing power, Saladin launched an invasion of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The campaign appeared favorable to him. His forces significantly outnumbered those available to Baldwin, whose kingdom seemed vulnerable. Yet events unfolded in a way few expected. Despite his illness, Baldwin personally accompanied his army into the field. The Crusader forces moved quickly and caught Saladin's army in a vulnerable position near Montgesard. The result was a stunning defeat for Saladin. His forces suffered heavy losses, and he narrowly escaped capture while retreating from the battlefield. For a leader who had enjoyed increasing success, the defeat was a painful lesson. Yet one of Saladin's greatest strengths was his ability to learn from failure. Rather than allowing the setback to destroy his ambitions, he studied the weaknesses that had contributed to the defeat. He recognized that unity alone was not enough. Victory required patience, preparation, and careful strategy. In the years that followed, he would become an even more disciplined and effective commander. The rivalry between Saladin and Baldwin created one of the most compelling chapters of medieval history. Both men faced immense challenges. One fought to unite a fractured world. The other fought to defend a kingdom while his own body slowly failed him. Neither was an ordinary ruler, and it was their struggle against one another that transformed them into legends. History often remembers great victories and great defeats, but sometimes it is great rivals who create the greatest stories of all. The balance of power in the Holy Land began to shift dramatically during the early 1180s. For years, Baldwin IV of Jerusalem had held the Crusader kingdom together through a combination of determination, political skill, and military leadership. Despite the devastating effects of leprosy, he had remained a capable ruler and a formidable opponent for Saladin. His presence provided stability at a time when the Kingdom of Jerusalem faced growing external threats. But Baldwin's illness could not be defeated forever. In 1185, the young king died at the age of 24. His death created a leadership vacuum that Jerusalem struggled to fill. The kingdom passed through a period of political uncertainty, marked by disputes among nobles and competing factions. Successors lacked Baldwin's authority, experience, and ability to unite rival interests. At the very moment when strong leadership was most needed, the kingdom became increasingly divided. Saladin watched these developments carefully. By this time, he had spent years strengthening his position, uniting Egypt and Syria, and building the military resources necessary for a larger confrontation. Unlike many rulers who rushed into war, Saladin understood the value of patience. He recognized that political weakness inside Jerusalem could prove just as important as victories on the battlefield. One figure in particular helped push both sides toward conflict: Raynald of Chatillon. Raynald had long been known for his aggressive and unpredictable actions. Despite periods of truce between Saladin and the Kingdom of Jerusalem, he repeatedly attacked Muslim caravans traveling through territories under his control. These raids threatened trade, violated agreements, and inflamed tensions across the region. Some accounts even suggest that he discussed attacking the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, a prospect that deeply alarmed and angered the Muslim world. For Saladin, Raynald's actions were more than simple provocations. They became a powerful justification for war. Diplomatic efforts increasingly failed. Trust between the two sides eroded. While leaders within Jerusalem argued among themselves, Saladin continued preparing for a decisive campaign. Armies were assembled, alliances strengthened, and resources gathered. Years of political and military preparation were finally approaching their ultimate test. Across the Holy Land, a sense of inevitability began to emerge. The kingdom that Baldwin had fought so hard to protect was now led by weaker hands. The Muslim world, once divided, stood more united than it had been in generations. Both sides understood that a major confrontation was coming. The question was no longer whether war would occur. The question was where and when. History often changes gradually, through years of political decisions and shifting alliances. But sometimes its direction changes because a single leader disappears. Baldwin's death removed one of the few men capable of maintaining the fragile balance between Jerusalem and Saladin. With that balance gone, the road to war lay open, and at its end waited the battle that would change the fate of the Holy Land. By 1187, the long struggle between Saladin and the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem had reached a breaking point. For years, he had worked toward a single objective: uniting the Muslim world and creating the conditions necessary to challenge Crusader power in the Holy Land. Now, after decades of political maneuvering, military reform, and careful preparation, the decisive confrontation had finally arrived. The Crusader leadership, now under Guy of Lusignan, faced a difficult situation. Saladin had assembled one of the largest Muslim armies seen in the region for generations and moved against the strategically important city of Tiberias. The Crusaders were forced to decide whether to remain in a strong defensive position or march across difficult terrain to relieve the city. They chose to march. It was exactly the opportunity Saladin had been waiting for. Rather than rushing into battle, Saladin relied on patience and strategy. He understood the landscape, the climate, and the weaknesses of his opponents. As the Crusader army advanced across the dry summer countryside of Galilee, Muslim forces constantly harassed them. Water became scarce. The heat grew unbearable. Exhaustion spread through the ranks. Every step weakened the army before the main battle had even begun. On July 4, 1187, the two sides met at the Battle of Hattin near the Horns of Hattin. The Crusaders were already suffering from thirst, fatigue, and disorganization. Saladin's forces surrounded them and denied them access to water. Smoke from deliberately set fires added to the chaos, while waves of attacks gradually broke the cohesion of the Crusader formations. What followed was not merely a defeat, it was the destruction of the kingdom's military strength. As the battle unfolded, resistance collapsed. Thousands of Crusader soldiers were killed, captured, or scattered. Among the prisoners were some of the most important leaders of the Crusader states, including King Guy himself. The military elite that had defended Jerusalem for generations had been shattered in a single day. For Saladin, the victory represented the culmination of years of effort. The triumph at Hattin was not the result of luck or a single brilliant decision. It was the product of decades spent building alliances, strengthening institutions, uniting divided territories, and preparing for exactly this moment. The emotional significance of the victory was immense. The young Kurdish noble whom few had expected to become a ruler had achieved what many Muslim leaders before him could not. The Crusader kingdom had suffered a catastrophic blow, and the path to Jerusalem now stood open. Hattin changed the course of Middle Eastern history. It demonstrated that determination alone was not enough to win great struggles. Success belonged to those who prepared patiently, acted strategically, and understood that the most important victories are often won long before the battle begins. Victory belongs not merely to the strongest army, but to those who prepare for it. In the aftermath of the Battle of Hattin, the balance of power in the Holy Land changed almost overnight. The Crusader army that had defended the Kingdom of Jerusalem for nearly a century had been shattered. Key leaders had been captured, major fortresses began falling one after another, and resistance weakened across the region. For Saladin, the moment he had spent years preparing for had finally arrived. The road to Jerusalem was open. As his forces advanced southward, cities and strongholds surrendered or were captured in rapid succession. The momentum created by Hattin was impossible to ignore. By September 1187, Saladin's army reached the walls of Jerusalem, the city that stood at the center of the conflict between Christians and Muslims. The siege that followed lasted only a matter of days. Unlike the long and devastating sieges that often characterized medieval warfare, Jerusalem's defenders understood the reality of their situation. With few troops, limited resources, and little hope of outside assistance, their chances of holding the city were slim. Negotiations soon began between Saladin and the city's leaders. On October 2, 1187, Jerusalem surrendered. For many observers, the most remarkable part of the story came afterward. When Crusader armies had captured Jerusalem during the First Crusade in 1099, contemporary sources described widespread slaughter, throughout the city. Thousands of Muslims and Jews were killed in the aftermath of the conquest. The memory of those events remained deeply embedded in both Muslim and Christian histories. Many expected Saladin to seek revenge. Instead, he chose a different path. Although ransoms were required for many inhabitants, large-scale massacres did not occur. Numerous civilians were allowed to leave peacefully after arrangements were made for their release. Saladin and his officials also worked to secure the freedom of many who could not afford their own ransom. Christian holy sites were generally respected, and the city avoided the kind of destruction that often followed medieval conquests. His actions surprised both supporters and opponents. Some Muslims who remembered the events of 1099 expected harsher treatment. Many Christians, fearing the worst, were astonished by the relatively restrained outcome. Saladin was certainly capable of ruthless military action when he believed it necessary, but in Jerusalem, he chose moderation over vengeance. This decision became one of the defining moments of his legacy. The recapture of Jerusalem was one of the greatest achievements of Saladin's life. Yet history remembers not only the fact that he won the city, but also how he treated those who had lost it. In a conflict shaped by decades of bloodshed, he demonstrated that victory did not require revenge. Sometimes the greatest display of power is not the ability to punish an enemy. Sometimes it is the ability to show mercy when the opportunity for revenge is finally within reach. And in Jerusalem, mercy proved more powerful than vengeance. The recapture of Jerusalem in 1187 sent shockwaves across Europe. The loss of Christianity's most sacred city was viewed as a disaster, and the response was swift. Calls for a new crusade spread throughout the continent, leading to the launch of the Third Crusade. Among the rulers who answered that call was one of the most famous warriors of the medieval age, Richard I of England. Richard quickly became the most formidable crusader commander Saladin had ever faced. Unlike many leaders who had opposed him before, Richard combined personal courage with genuine military talent. His arrival revitalized the Crusader cause and transformed the conflict into a contest between two of the most celebrated figures of the Middle Ages. Across the Holy Land, soldiers and civilians alike watched as two legendary leaders prepared to test one another. The war that followed was marked by a series of intense campaigns, battles, and negotiations. One of the most significant engagements occurred at the Battle of Arsuf, where Richard secured an important victory against Saladin's forces. Yet despite setbacks on the battlefield, Saladin remained determined and avoided the kind of catastrophic defeat that had destroyed the Crusader army at Hattin. What made this struggle remarkable was not only the fighting, but also the respect that developed between the two opponents. Although they never met face-to-face, contemporary and later accounts describe a relationship characterized by mutual admiration. Richard respected Saladin's intelligence, leadership, and persistence. Saladin, in turn, recognized Richard as a commander worthy of serious respect. Their rivalry became one of the most famous examples of chivalry in medieval history. Numerous stories emerged from the conflict, some historical and others shaped by later tradition. Tales circulated of Saladin sending gifts, horses, or medical assistance when Richard was ill or in need. While historians debate the accuracy of some of these accounts, they reflect how both Muslim and Christian writers came to view Saladin, not merely as a conqueror, but as a ruler associated with honor, generosity, and restraint. Despite years of warfare, neither side achieved a complete victory. Richard failed to retake Jerusalem, while Saladin could not drive the Crusaders entirely from the coast. Eventually, negotiations produced a settlement that allowed Christian pilgrims access to Jerusalem while leaving the city under Muslim control. The conflict ended without lasting peace, but it left behind something unusual: mutual respect between enemies. In an age often defined by religious war and political rivalry, Saladin and Richard demonstrated that admiration can survive even where agreement cannot. Sometimes peace remains out of reach, but respect endures long after the fighting ends. When people remember Saladin, they often think of great battles, the recapture of Jerusalem, or his rivalry with Richard the Lionheart. Yet the qualities that made him exceptional were not limited to the battlefield. Many of the accounts written by both Muslim and Christian observers focus less on his military victories and more on his character. Away from war, Saladin was known for his discipline and deep religious commitment. He devoted significant time to prayer, Islamic scholarship, and matters of faith. Unlike many rulers who surrounded themselves with luxury and extravagance, Saladin cultivated a reputation for modesty. Even at the height of his power, he generally avoided the excessive displays of wealth that were common among medieval monarchs. His relationship with power was also unusual. Saladin controlled vast territories stretching across Egypt, Syria, and surrounding regions. Yet contemporary sources frequently describe him as more interested in duty than personal enrichment. He spent enormous resources on military campaigns, public works, charitable causes, and the administration of his state. By the end of his life, despite ruling one of the most powerful realms in the Middle East, he left behind surprisingly little personal wealth. Stories of generosity became central to his reputation. Chroniclers recorded numerous examples of Saladin providing aid to the poor, assisting widows and orphans, rewarding loyal service, and showing mercy to defeated opponents. Some stories may have been embellished over time, but the consistency of these accounts across different sources suggests that generosity was a genuine part of his leadership style. This created an interesting contrast. On the battlefield, Saladin could be determined, strategic, and relentless. He commanded armies, conquered cities, and reshaped the political map of the region. Yet those who knew him also described a ruler capable of humility, compassion, and restraint. Perhaps that is what truly distinguished Saladin from many conquerors of history. His legacy was not built solely on the lands he won or the enemies he defeated. It was built on the belief that power was most meaningful when guided by principle, and that greatness required more than victory alone. So what truly made Saladin different? Not simply that he conquered kingdoms, but that he remained respected long after the wars were over. In March 1193, after a lifetime spent in war, diplomacy, and leadership, Saladin died in Damascus at the age of approximately 55. For more than 2 decades, he had been one of the most influential figures in the Middle East, uniting vast territories, defeating powerful enemies, and restoring Muslim control over Jerusalem. His death marked the end of an era. Yet one of the most remarkable details about Saladin's life emerged after he was gone. Despite ruling a powerful empire that stretched across Egypt, Syria, and much of the surrounding region, Saladin left behind surprisingly little personal wealth. According to contemporary accounts, his treasury contained only a small amount of money, far less than many expected from a ruler of his stature. Much of his wealth had been spent on military campaigns, charitable works, religious institutions, and the administration of his state. The contrast was striking. A man who commanded kingdoms possessed little in personal riches when he died. Over the centuries, Saladin's reputation grew far beyond the lands he once ruled. For Muslims, he became a symbol of unity, leadership, and the recovery of Jerusalem. For many Christians, including some who had once regarded him as an enemy, he earned admiration for his conduct, generosity, and sense of honor. Medieval European writers often portrayed him as a model of chivalry, while Muslim historians celebrated his faith and commitment to the broader interests of the Islamic world. His influence extended long after the Crusades ended. Political leaders, military commanders, and scholars continued to study his achievements. His name became associated not only with victory, but with the idea that strength and mercy could exist together. Many kings have won battles. Many rulers have conquered cities. But very few have earned the respect of those who stood against them. That is why Saladin remains one of history's most enduring figures. His legacy was not built solely on military success or political power. It was shaped by the manner in which he exercised that power and by the principles he sought to uphold while doing so. Perhaps that is the final lesson of his story. Was Saladin remembered because he conquered Jerusalem? Or because he showed the world that power, when guided by honor, can leave a legacy greater than conquest itself?